Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Today, leading elites in the West portray nationalism, the nation state, and sovereignty as a threat to what is called the liberal global order, and indeed to democracy itself. So what's the liberal global order? What are the core values of Western civilization and constitutional democracy? Well, today there are two totally antagonistic worldviews locked in existential ideological combat. First, there's the vision of politics and culture articulated by Pope St. John Paul II and President Ronald Reagan, and as John O'Sullivan has eloquently written, also Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, this vision includes two things: a philosophical, moral superstructure and a democratic political order. At the philosophical, moral level, the Roman Catholic pontiff and the Protestant president shared a similar vision of a global order based on Christian civilization, including the embrace of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. This means a belief in a transcendent moral order, in the concept of truth, and in some form of natural law, whether from Aquinas or the American Declaration of Independence. Second, at the political level, the John Paul II Reagan worldview embraced national independence. There's no doubt that Pope St. John Paul II was a Polish patriot. President Ronald Reagan's views of national sovereignty were expressed forcefully in his first inaugural address, January 1981, about 40 years ago. Speaking directly to allies, Reagan declared, quote, "To those neighbors and allies who share our freedom, we will strengthen our historic ties and assure them of our support and firm commitment. We will match loyalty with loyalty." Okay, as Jerome was talking earlier, Reagan saying 40 years ago, we will match loyalty with loyalty. We will not use our friendship to impose on their sovereignty, for our own sovereignty is not for sale. Today, the concept of a liberal global order has been, it's been basically transformed. It's different than it was during the heyday of, say, of Reagan and Pope John Paul. Today, this worldview is being challenged, both at the philosophical, moral level and also at the political level, by an ideology that I call transnational progressivism, or global progressivism. At the philosophical, moral level, transnational progressivism rejects the concept of an objective world order. On the contrary, they believe that morality does not come from God, or nature, or reason, or some form of empiricism, but is socially constructed. Essentially, it's a question of will and power. They reject the concept of objective truth. This philosophical progressive ideology essentially dominates Western institutions, its universities, its schools, and certainly the mainstream media. And all of this, of course, has political consequences. At the political level, the consequences of progressive ideology is the rejection of national independence and a domestic order based on essentially the norm. It rejects the norms of what Jerome Mazzoni has referred to as the moral minimum, the biblical Ten Commandments. That's rejected. It's all a matter of power, of will, triumph of the will, you might say. Instead of equality of citizenship and individual rights, progressivism supports group rights, but only those groups that are deemed as marginalized by Western civilization, groups such as ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, women, LGBT, illegal immigrants, and so on. Significantly, very significantly, progressives favor restricting free speech if it offends these designated victim groups. Now, we hear a lot about illiberalism these days, about so-called populists. But ironically, today's progressive liberals are the ones who actually reject what used to be considered traditional liberal values, such as free speech and individual rights. Specifically, transnational progressives favor restricting the sovereignty of nation states, including democratic nation states, They argue that global governance requires transferring power from democratic nation states to supranational entities. Transnational progressivism is the dominant ideology among elites in the United Nations, at the European Union, and in myriad transnational organizations throughout the world, particularly throughout the West. Transnational progressivism is an attempt really to drastically alter the principles of Western civilization and constitutional democracy. National conservatism, employing the vision of democratic sovereignty articulated by John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, is a project to revitalize Western civilization and strengthen the democratic nation state. We are in the middle of a worldwide struggle between transnational progressivism and national conservatism. There are large battles and there are small battles. I'll give you an example of a small battle. 3 weeks ago, the BBC reported at the University of Sheffield in the UK, 20 students were hired by the university to report offensive comments by other students and by professors, sort of to spy on them, in other words. An example, what are examples of offensive comments? Where if someone, one of the students should say, why are you searching for things to be put off about? Why is this always about race? If you ask these questions, then this would be considered an offensive comment. Why is the university doing this? The project is their stated purpose is, quote, an opening up of the conversation. And also, quote, understanding the impact of racism. Well, one wonders if this is Great Britain in 2020 or East Germany in the 1970s. Okay, that's the micro level. The macro level, progressive liberals throughout the West, in the name of combating hate speech, are attempting to limit free speech. In the United States, a group called the Center for American Progress, which is a liberal centrist sort of Clinton type of group, heavily funded by George Soros, is attempting to pressure tech companies to censor critical commentary related to policies that affect these issues: race, religion, gender, LGBTQ, and immigrant status. Google and Twitter, of course, have been censoring conservative viewpoints for years. In Germany, Angela Merkel has been pressuring internet providers to block criticism of her migration policy. Well, let's turn to migration just for a second, because it's a key front in the global conflict between transnational progressives and national conservatives. More than 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan declared, quote, a nation that cannot control its borders is not a nation. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote in the Politics, he gave, different examples of migration into city-states and how this affected citizens. And the effect was mostly negative, overwhelmingly negative. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, now the United States was very successful in assimilating millions of new immigrants, including my grandparents. However, this success rested to a large extent on the fact of immigration restriction laws that were enacted in the 1920s, because this facilitated the patriotic assimilation of millions of Italians and Poles and Jews who came to the United States at that time. Today migration remains a central issue. How are we going to accept immigrants? Some countries say no, most say yes, but how many, from where, under what conditions? And the single most important policy question in immigration is who decides. There are three possibilities. One is the supranational institutions decide, the European Commission or the European Court of Human Rights. Two is the migrants themselves would decide. They just come, and that's a fait accompli. Or three, the citizens of democratic nation states decide. So the question is migration or immigration policy made democratically or anti-democratically? It's as simple as that. Let's examine for a moment the role of the judiciary in a democratic state. We hear a lot about the importance of the rule of law, and obviously that's very important. The rule of law is important. Now, the rule of law, however, should not be confused with the rule of lawyers or the rule of judges. particularly foreign law, foreign judge, or even your own. In 2003, an esteemed American jurist, the late Robert Bork, wrote a book called Coercing Virtue, the Worldwide Rule of Judges. Bork declared, quote, "Judicial imperialism is manifest everywhere." And he went on, he particularly looked at Israel and the United States and Europe and Canada. And what would Bork mean by judicial imperialism? What he meant was that judges, instead of acting as judges and interpreting the law, they were acting as elected legislators or unelected legislators, acting as legislators and actually making law. Bork described this judicial usurpation as subversive. That's Bork's word. It was subversive of constitutional democracy because unelected judges were making law instead of legislators. And what this meant, Bork said, quote, "It elevated the objectives of a dominant minority over the democratic process." Today, across North America and in Europe, unelected officials, judges, and bureaucrats are increasingly making decisions that in a healthy democracy are not theirs to make. The struggle over Brexit is a textbook case of the conflict between national conservatism and transnational progressivism. Essentially, Brexit was and is a conflict between democracy and oligarchy, between majority rule and minority rule. You know, in a brilliant essay on Brexit by journalist Christopher Caldwell, writing in the Claremont Review of Books, he argued that the Brexit debate brought to the fore the primal issue of ultimate political loyalty. Caldwell said, he asked the question, in the UK, were UK citizens loyal to the long-standing British nation, or were they loyal to a supranational political structure in Brussels? Well, we know many were, many went over, many transferred their loyalty from Britain to the EU. So the Brexit referendum was a defining, we've heard eloquent discussion just recently, just the last speaker, that this was a defining moment in Rome as well, in 21st century global politics. This is a defining moment. Through Brexit, the British people have reaffirmed the greatest political right of all, the right of a free people to rule themselves. In conclusion, I argue that democracy cannot exist without the nation state, and as John Paul II and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher suggested, the democratic nation state cannot exist without a strong patriotic sentiment and a clear sense of national identity among its citizens. Thank you.